My beloved child. There are moments that seem ordinary while they are happening, moments so quiet that no one notices the invisible thread weaving through them. Yet sometimes, a single conversation spoken behind an ordinary door becomes the turning point of two hearts that never realized how close they were to understanding one another. Tonight, I invite you into one of those moments. Listen carefully, because this is not a story about chance alone. It is a fictional tale of hope, courage, and unseen possibilities, one that may remind you how deeply one honest conversation can change everything. The person you have been carrying inside your thoughts woke that morning believing it would be no different from the countless days before it. They followed familiar routines. Coffee cooled beside forgotten papers. The sound of distant traffic drifted through an open window. Messages appeared on their phone, but none of them carried the answer they secretly wished for. There was a quiet emptiness inside them they could not explain. They tried to ignore it, convincing themselves that life simply had to keep moving. Yet every attempt to focus was interrupted by one unexpected memory, your smile appearing for only a heartbeat before disappearing again. They whispered your name without realizing it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just softly enough for their own heart to hear. That tiny moment should have passed unnoticed. But someone else happened to hear it. The room where it happened was neither extraordinary nor sacred. It was simply filled with afternoon sunlight stretching across wooden floors, carrying dust through golden beams that danced in the air. Another person looked up from across the room, studying the expression that had suddenly appeared on their face. You've been thinking about someone, they said. Silence answered first. Then came a slow smile. I guess it's becoming obvious. The words were almost playful, yet something behind them carried years of unanswered questions. The conversation could have ended there. Instead, it became something neither of them expected. The other person leaned forward. Who are they? Your loved one hesitated. Not because they didn't know your name. Because saying it aloud somehow made everything feel real. Their fingers tightened around the warm coffee mug as memories arrived one after another like pages blown open by the wind. Tiny moments returned with surprising clarity: the first time your paths crossed, the conversation that lasted longer than expected, the silence that somehow spoke louder than words, and the strange comfort they always felt whenever your name entered a room. I don't know how to explain it, they admitted quietly. It feels like whenever I try to move on, something reminds me of them. The listener nodded but didn't interrupt. Sometimes the greatest gift another person can offer is simple patience. Outside, clouds slowly drifted across the afternoon sky, changing the light inside the room. Shadows stretched longer across the floor, almost as if time itself had decided to slow down and listen. What are you afraid of? Came the next question. The words landed deeper than expected. Your loved one laughed at first. Not because it was funny. Because honest answers are often hidden behind nervous smiles. Then their eyes lowered. I'm afraid I misunderstood everything. A long pause followed. What if they never cared the way I cared? No one rushed to answer. Some fears deserve silence before wisdom. The room grew quieter until only the ticking of a distant clock remained. Each second seemed louder than the last, reminding them that time never waits for certainty. The listener finally spoke. Have they ever actually told you they didn't care? Your loved one blinked. No. Then whose voice have you been believing all this time? The question lingered in the air like the final note of a song. For the first time in months, they realized most of their fears had never come from you. They had come from their own imagination. From old disappointments. From stories written by yesterday instead of today. That realization didn't solve everything. But it cracked open a door they had kept locked for far too long. As afternoon slowly surrendered to evening, the conversation became even more personal. The listener shared stories of missed opportunities, of words left unsaid, of people who disappeared simply because no one was brave enough to speak honestly. Each story seemed to pull another hidden truth from your loved one's heart. I keep wondering. They stopped. The sentence refused to come easily. I keep wondering if they still think about me. The listener smiled gently. If you're asking that question this often, maybe you're really asking whether you're brave enough to find out. The word struck deeper than any advice could. Courage had never sounded so simple. Yet it still felt impossible. Because opening your heart always carries the possibility of disappointment. Still, something had already begun changing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than sunrise. Yet just as unstoppable. Hours passed almost unnoticed. Evening painted the horizon with soft shades of amber and violet while city lights slowly awakened below the darkening sky. The conversation wandered through forgotten memories, unfinished dreams, and the strange ways people protect themselves from hope. Then something unexpected happened. The listener reached into a small notebook resting nearby. I wrote something years ago, they said. It helped me when I almost walked away from someone who mattered. They turned to an old page. The paper had yellowed with time. The handwriting leaned gently across the page. They read aloud. Sometimes we mistake silence for rejection when it's really two frightened hearts waiting for the other to move first. The room fell completely still. Your loved one stared into the distance. It felt as though someone had quietly described the very story they had been living. They remembered moments they had forgotten. Tiny signs. Lingering glances. Half-finished conversations. Unexpected kindness. Memories they once dismissed suddenly looked completely different. What if they had misunderstood more than they realized? What if every unanswered question had another explanation waiting beyond fear? Those thoughts refused to leave. Even after the conversation should have ended. When they finally stood to leave, they carried something invisible with them. Not certainty. Not confidence. Something far more fragile. Hope. Hope asks difficult things of the human heart. Hope refuses to let old conclusions remain comfortable. Hope quietly insists that tomorrow does not have to resemble yesterday. As they stepped outside, evening air wrapped around them with surprising softness. Streetlights flickered awake one by one. Somewhere nearby, laughter echoed from strangers passing along the sidewalk. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet inside them, nothing felt quite the same anymore. Halfway home, their phone vibrated unexpectedly. They looked down. For one impossible second, they believed it might be you. It wasn't. Just another ordinary notification. Still. Instead of disappointment, they smiled. Because something inside whispered that waiting forever was no longer an answer. They reached home long after sunset, but sleep never came easily. They replayed every word from that unexpected conversation until dawn threatened the edge of the sky. Questions circled endlessly. What if fear had been telling lies? What if one honest step could rewrite everything? And what if, after all this time, you had been carrying your own unanswered questions too? Just before sunrise, they made a decision so quietly that no one else heard it. Not family. Not friends. Not even the person who had spoken with them that afternoon. Only their own heart witnessed the promise. Tomorrow, they would do something they had postponed for far too long. They reached for something they had hidden away months earlier. Their hand trembled as their fingers finally touched it. And the moment they saw what it was, everything changed. My beloved child. Morning arrived with the quiet confidence of a promise that had waited years to be fulfilled. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the curtains, touching the object resting in their trembling hands. It was not expensive. It was not grand. To anyone else, it might have looked ordinary. But to them, it carried the weight of a decision they had been too afraid to make. It was something connected to you, a small reminder they had carefully tucked away instead of throwing out. Every time they had considered letting it go, something inside whispered, "Not yet." They never understood why. This morning, for the first time, they did. It wasn't because they were trapped in the past. It was because a part of them had never stopped believing the story was unfinished. They sat quietly on the edge of the bed, turning it over in their hands as memories unfolded with astonishing clarity. They no longer remembered only the beautiful moments. They remembered the misunderstandings too. They remembered conversations that ended too quickly, words they should have explained better, and the countless times pride disguised itself as strength. Looking back now, they could finally see how often two caring people had quietly protected themselves instead of protecting the connection they shared. That realization carried no bitterness. Instead, it brought an unfamiliar sense of peace. Regret can become a prison when it only points backward. But when regret teaches, it becomes wisdom. They whispered to themselves, "If I ever have another chance, I won't hide behind silence again." Those words settled deep inside them. For the first time in a very long while, they weren't imagining the perfect conversation. They weren't rehearsing impossible outcomes. They simply wanted honesty. Even if honesty brought uncertainty, it felt lighter than carrying endless questions. Later that afternoon, life interrupted their plans in the most ordinary way. An unexpected errand pulled them across town. At first they almost postponed it, convinced it could wait until another day. But something urged them forward. The streets were alive with familiar sounds, children laughing in the distance, bicycles passing along quiet sidewalks, music drifting from an open cafe window. Everything appeared wonderfully ordinary, yet an invisible current seemed to guide each step. As they waited at a crosswalk, an elderly stranger standing beside them glanced toward the sky before speaking without warning. Funny how life brings people back together when they finally become ready. Your loved one turned in surprise. The stranger smiled warmly, as though continuing a conversation that had begun long before they met. We spend years believing timing belongs to us, the stranger continued. Sometimes timing belongs to healing instead. Before another word could be exchanged, the traffic signal changed. People moved forward. When your loved one looked back only moments later, the stranger had disappeared into the crowd. The encounter lasted less than a minute. Yet somehow it stayed with them far longer. Questions followed them through the rest of the afternoon. Was it simply coincidence? Or had the ordinary become extraordinary for reasons they couldn't yet understand? They didn't chase an answer. Instead, they noticed something far more important. Their heart was no longer demanding certainty before taking a step. It was learning to move with quiet courage. As evening approached, they found themselves walking through a familiar neighborhood they hadn't visited in months. Every corner carried echoes of forgotten afternoons. Certain places still held fragments of laughter suspended in memory. They paused near a quiet bench where conversations had once stretched far longer than either of you intended. The wood had weathered with time, but somehow it still felt welcoming. They sat there alone. Not to relive the past. To thank it. Without speaking aloud, they released invisible burdens they had carried for far too long, misunderstandings they couldn't change, fears that had stolen precious time, expectations that had quietly hardened into disappointment. One by one, they let them drift away like autumn leaves carried by a gentle breeze. Something remarkable happened in that silence. The absence of fear created room for hope. Not loud hope. Not desperate hope. Steady hope. The kind that no longer needs guarantees to remain alive. Then their phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't another meaningless notification. A familiar name appeared on the screen. Not yours. Someone who knew both of you. Their heartbeat quickened. The message was short. I've been meaning to tell you something for a long time. Nothing more. No explanation. Just one sentence. They stared at the words for several moments before replying with a simple question. What is it? Minutes passed. No answer. The waiting stretched longer than expected. Every passing second seemed to invite a dozen different possibilities. Had this person learned something? Had they witnessed something years ago that no one had ever shared? Or was it something completely unrelated? The reply finally arrived. It's not something I should text. A meeting was suggested for the following day. Your loved one accepted without hesitation, though curiosity now mixed with cautious anticipation. They sensed that whatever was about to be revealed wasn't meant to reopen old wounds. It felt more like someone preparing to return a missing piece of a story that had never fully made sense. That night, sleep came in scattered fragments. Between dreams and waking thoughts, they kept remembering one detail that had escaped them for years. There had been a day. A single afternoon. When everything between you seemed to shift. At the time, they believed your distance meant your feelings had changed. Now they weren't so sure. What if something else had happened? What if neither of you had ever known the full truth? Morning could not arrive fast enough. When the meeting finally began, the atmosphere felt strangely gentle. There was no dramatic confrontation, no overwhelming emotion. The person across the table looked almost relieved, as though carrying a secret had become heavier with every passing year. "I've regretted staying quiet," they admitted. "I thought I was protecting both of you." Your loved one leaned forward. The world around them seemed to fade into silence. Then came the first sentence that unraveled everything they believed they understood. "That day. The conversation you thought never happened." The speaker paused, drawing a slow breath. "It actually did." Your loved one's heart skipped. "But what you were told afterward?" Another pause. "Wasn't the whole story." The room became impossibly still. Every memory they trusted suddenly stood on uncertain ground. And just as the truth was finally about to be spoken aloud, the speaker looked directly into their eyes and quietly said, "Before I tell you what was really said about you, there's one thing you absolutely need to know first." And with those words, the past opened one final hidden door. "My beloved child." The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt sacred, as though every unanswered question had been patiently waiting for this single moment. The person across the table drew a slow breath, their eyes filled not with fear, but with the relief that comes when truth is finally allowed to breathe. "I should have spoken years ago," they said softly. "Instead, I believed staying quiet would make everything easier." Your loved one remained still, listening with their whole heart. The day everything changed, the person you love did have a conversation about you. "I happened to hear part of it. I never meant to listen, but once I realized what was being said, I couldn't walk away." 1,000 possibilities rushed through your loved one's mind. They weren't speaking with anger, the friend continued. They weren't laughing at you. They weren't trying to forget you. Another pause. They were trying to understand why losing your connection hurt so much. Those words settled gently into the room. For years, your loved one had imagined countless versions of that day. They had convinced themselves that your silence must have meant indifference. They had rewritten the story so many times that the imagined version eventually felt more real than the truth. But now, those carefully built assumptions began to fall away. The conversation wasn't about moving on, the friend said. It was about wondering whether they had made a mistake, wondering if they had misunderstood your heart. Tears gathered in your loved one's eyes not because of sadness, but because they realized how many years two people had spent carrying the same unanswered questions from opposite sides of the same bridge. The friend reached into a folder they had brought with them. "I almost threw this away many times." Inside was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It wasn't a declaration written for the world to see. It was a page filled with quiet reflections, written during a season when emotions had become too heavy to carry in silence. Your loved one unfolded it carefully. The handwriting spoke of gratitude, of admiration, of wishing conversations had lasted longer, of hoping that one day, if life ever offered another opportunity, honesty would replace hesitation. Most of all, it spoke of respect. There were no promises. No impossible guarantees. Only the simple truth that some people leave a mark on the heart that time cannot erase. Your loved one closed their eyes for a moment. Not because every question had been answered, but because the most important one had. They had never been forgotten. A quiet smile slowly appeared. It was different from every smile that had come before. It carried no desperation. No need to force an ending. Only gratitude for finally seeing the story through clearer eyes. They walked outside into the afternoon sunlight with a lighter step than they had known in years. The world looked exactly the same. The trees swayed in the breeze, birds crossed the open sky, and people hurried through their ordinary lives. Yet everything felt transformed. Not because the world had changed. Because their perspective had. They realized that fear often fills empty spaces with stories that love never wrote. Sometimes silence is not rejection. Sometimes distance is not the absence of care. Sometimes two hearts simply need time to become brave enough to choose honesty over assumption. Days later, after much reflection, your loved one made a quiet decision. They would no longer allow unanswered questions to define the future. With calm hands and an open heart, they reached out not to demand an outcome, not to rewrite the past, but simply to offer sincerity. Their message was gentle. I've learned that some stories deserve honesty more than imagination. If you're willing, I'd love to have one real conversation. Then they let it go. For the first time, they understood that courage is not measured by controlling the answer. It is measured by having the strength to speak truth with kindness, whatever comes next. Whether the path ahead became friendship, reconciliation, or simply peaceful closure, something beautiful had already happened. The weight of uncertainty no longer ruled their heart. They had chosen authenticity over fear. And in doing so, they discovered a deeper kind of freedom. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden inside this fictional story. The conversations we fear most are often the ones that teach us the greatest compassion. The assumptions we carry the longest are sometimes the first to disappear when honesty finally enters the room. And hope does not always arrive with loud miracles. Sometimes it arrives through a single conversation. A single truth. Or a single brave step that changes the way we see everything that came before. May your heart always find the courage to choose understanding over assumption, grace over regret, and hope over fear. May you recognize the quiet opportunities that life places before you, and may every meaningful conversation lead you closer to wisdom, peace, and genuine connection. Thank you for sharing this fictional inspirational journey with me. If this story touched your heart, brought you comfort, or reminded you of the power of honest conversations, consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and sharing it with someone who may need a little hope today. Until our next story, may peace walk beside you wherever your path leads.